We continue our study of the book of Proverbs, wisdom, and various related categories within that subject as we move through the book, not verse by verse, but topic by topic, going through the book that way. Last week, we just did not get finished with enough of the material on wisdom and honesty. So tonight, wisdom and honesty number two. There were just so many good things that we need to talk about, and I was going to try to rush through them at the end there last week. It just couldn't be done. So we're going to talk about that this week in just a few moments. Before we do, Brother John is going to lead us in a prayer, so let us bow.
Our God and our Father in heaven, we thank you for this time that we have together to study from your word. Father, we pray that you'll be with Steve this evening on the topic of Proverbs and the wisdom that you have left for us in the pages of Scripture. Father, we pray that you'll be with us and open our hearts and open our minds. Help us to take this information with us. Help us to be better Christians for it. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Oh, a little bit of good news first. The mission team that is in Peru, and I can't pronounce the name of the town. I hope they will do that before too long, but I don't know. Anyway, it's spelled Huacho. But anyway, the mission team's there. We've got 5 folks on that team. They had 11 baptisms so far through yesterday. Several hundred Bible studies held or in progress, along with the medical clinic that they're doing. So many good things going on as a result of that mission trip. Let's continue to pray for them and for their safety and for the good things that are taking place there in that town. All right, we talk about tonight wisdom and honesty number 2. I found this little graphic on Facebook. You know, people find little things like to put it on Facebook. Sometimes it catches my attention, sometimes it doesn't. This one caught my attention because we're talking about honesty. We're talking about integrity. And good old Zig Ziglar, he's got lots of good quotes. He had a lot of good material he's written. With integrity, you have nothing to fear, since you have nothing to hide. We kind of hinted at that same subject back when we started talking about this some time ago, and that is, you know, when you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything extra. All you've got to remember are the facts that you told. Tell them the same way every time. And integrity is just a lot easier in so many ways. You don't have anything to fear because you've already laid the facts out there. So that was, I thought, a nice opening for tonight's lesson as we continue to talk about honesty. We flew by this last week, so I want to come back to it. This is probably one of the most practical admonitions that the wise man might have given the people at his time. We have to remember that they did not have a GPS. And they could not walk out somewhere with a device and give the latitude and the longitude. They, of course, didn't know what those things were. So, well, the corner of my property is right here, and I can prove it with scientific evidence. They didn't even have a compass. I read about the history of the compass, and the Chinese apparently had some form of it a long time ago, but it was the 11th century before they started using it for navigating, and it was the 13th century before AD, before it began to be used in the Middle East and Europe. So they didn't have a compass to go by. So they had landmarks, and those landmarks were stones. I've got some pictures of those in a minute. And of course, you know that stones can be moved. And after they've been moved, it might be your word against mine. Well, you moved my stones. No, I didn't. That's where they've always been. This is my property. No, this is my property. Well, very dim view, the landmarks for your neighbor's property. And of course, you think about it, you wouldn't have to, you just move a few markers one way or the other, and pretty soon you take really a lot of property away from your neighbor. It could be a very serious thing. So the wise man talks twice about this in particular. Do not remove the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. And of course, as far as the land of Canaan, it was divided when the tribes got there. And the tribes went different places and got their portions of the promised land. And the land was supposed to stay in the family. And God, through the law, made provisions for that with the 7 years, the year of Jubilee, and all of that. And people were not supposed to be deprived of their land. It was supposed to come back to a family eventually in every case. So do not move the markers that say, here's your property versus here's your neighbors. They are to stay where they are. And then in chapter 23, verses 10 and 11 there, do not remove the ancient landmark. Don't enter the fields of the fatherless, for their Redeemer is mighty. He will plead their cause against you. Can you imagine someone so low as to take advantage of a death in a family? Let's say that the man of the family died, the father, the husband, and a neighbor said, aha, this is a good time. You know, women don't know anything about landmarks. They don't know where the property is. And so while there's still grieving going on about the death of the father and husband, he goes over there and, moves those stones a little bit one way or the other to enlarge his property, taking advantage of that. And of course, that's one of the things that the Lord would certainly find as abomination, to take advantage of someone in a helpless situation like that. And Redeemer capitalized there because, it's the Lord himself. He's going to be the prosecuting attorney. If you do something like that, he's going to say, you did this despicable thing. You moved a landmark, not of someone who knew what was going on, but of someone who was basically helpless and not even in a position to realize that you did it. So these landmarks were not to be moved. Back in Deuteronomy 19:14, Deuteronomy 29:17 or 27:17, and even in Job 24 and verse 2, all three of those places, and perhaps more in the Old Testament, spoke of not moving these boundary markers. One of the most basic forms of criminal activity, I guess, that the people could have known back then. Second only, I guess, to stealing property that was movable. But in this case, moving stones that were movable, such as that pile of stones right there. I mentioned last week, as we were going through this very quickly, that out in the country, this would be more likely what you would see. Now, the pictures that I have here are not necessarily all in Palestine or the Holy Land, but it's the same sort of thing. That's what they had to use for markers, something that would last. It could be moved away by someone who was not honest, but they would last a long time if they were left alone. So here's the kind of marker that they might have had, several stones piled up together. In an urban area, it said they might have just had one big stone at different places around, marking property. I suppose the thought that would be sufficient, and maybe you'd be less likely to get away with it if you started trying to move one big stone in a place where there were a lot of people around, as opposed to a rural setting here. Here's some others from around the world. Again, not all of these are in Palestine, but all of them suggest what might have been used depending on what kind of stones you had to mark your property. And some would have been harder to move than others there, obviously. But if you were lacking in integrity and determined, I suppose you could do it. And then it would be basically impossible, unless there were some sort of feature in the land otherwise to tell you where it goes, to know whether it's been moved or not after a little while. So those were not to be tampered with. And we could make lots of spiritual applications, and I think most preachers would probably with this subject, and talk about how we're not to move the spiritual markers that God has given us for the truth, and that's all true. But we're both basically focusing tonight on a very literal, physical application, and that was stealing someone's property by moving the landmarks that marked that property. Okay, do not remove the ancient landmarks. Let's move on to the idea of deceit of flattery, of pretending to be a friend to someone when you're not, or being a friend when you really should be. He who gives the right answer kisses the lips. We flew through this last week too as time was running out. The kiss on the lips was not considered anything out of place back then. Good friends would do that. And it was a sign that you are a very special person to me in those days. Apparently, not everybody would do that. There were probably less formal greetings for some who weren't close friends. But if you gave a right answer, if you told the truth, whether it be to that person that you're talking to, or someone and you're talking about that person and you're maybe testifying or something like that, to give a right answer is like a warm, genuine expression of friendship. I really care about you. This is the good friends would do who kissed, who brought a kiss to another person's lips because they were friends. It was that honorable and that special a thing. Okay, the verses in between here don't really apply to what we're talking about. Prepare your outside work, maybe fit it for yourself in the field, and afterward build your house. More about preparation there. But now this last verse here does. Do not be a witness against your neighbor without cause, for would you deceive with your lips? So what seems to be the idea here is someone who is very quick to speak something against his neighbor, maybe too quick. Not everything needs to be said. Sometimes there are things that simply be forgiven and go on. And there's that attitude where, well, I've got a chance to say something to reflect on him negatively, and that we sometimes think maybe makes somebody feels a little bit elevated themselves. I've said something about him. I've shown people what he really is or what he's really like. So that makes me a little bit taller. Well, it may in someone's own mind, but in reality, it just makes them lesser if they take pleasure in doing that. And that's what would seem to be the case here. I can't wait to testify against my neighbor. Don't be a witness against your neighbor without cause. Be sure there's a reason for it. It's something that needs to be done. Wait till you're called on, perhaps. Don't run around the neighborhood saying, "Let me tell you something about my neighbor," but rather, wait till the authorities call you and say, "We got something we've got to settle here in a judicial setting, and we need you to tell the truth about this situation." Well, then you've got to tell the story. But that's a different attitude than being excited about telling evil about someone else. Don't deceive with your lips. If we're not careful, we could witness against our neighbor and get carried away with it and get to like it, and actually it could lead to deceit rather than the truth. Whoever falsely boasts of giving is like clouds and wind without rain. Clouds and wind without rain. When you see clouds coming up of a certain nature and the wind starts blowing and things start shifting around, you say, I think probably there's a rainstorm coming. But not always. Sometimes there are winds and clouds without rain. And if in that part of the world, probably you would say, "Oh, I'm disappointed. I was really counting on the rain." They didn't get a lot of rain sometimes in some parts of the region, and rain was a welcome thing. And to have clouds and wind come through and not get any rain out of it, that would be a disappointment. But what Solomon is saying here is a person who boasts of giving, and we would think in terms of maybe the tithes that they were supposed to give, other offerings or sacrifices, some of which were optional, or maybe just doing some good for some poor people somewhere. And somebody boasts of how great giving they do, and how much of a giver they are. And his advice was, Don't be boasting falsely, which is a pretty good idea not to boast at all, but certainly boasting falsely because people figure it out. And people figure out eventually that this person who does that is like that cloud and wind. It says rain's coming, but rain doesn't. Nothing effectual, nothing important comes out of it, even though great things are promised. And it's interesting that in Scripture, this image is used a number of times. The idea of weather indicators saying, hey, it's going to do something, when in fact it doesn't. And that's often used, well, in every case that I'm going to refer to here, it's used to describe people. For instance, Jude 1 in verse 12, Jude was dealing with false teachers. Very similar, it sounds like, to some of the ones that Peter was dealing with in 2 Peter, particularly chapter 2, because they're almost described some of the same ways. They were people who were both teaching that which was not true and also fleshly, living fleshly as far as their character was concerned. And so they could ruin Christians if Christians started to follow them. They could just wreak havoc with a congregation of God's people if they got them to follow both false doctrine as well as fleshly living. So God is very hard on them through the writings of Jude and Peter. Jude says, they are spots in your love feast, while they feast with you without fear, serving only themselves. They weren't at all what they pretended to be, and what they really were was not good at all. They are clouds without water, carried about by the winds. Late autumn trees without fruit, twice dead, pulled up by the roots. There's that weather image again. You know, it's like, here's some clouds, and oh, they're going to bring us some really much needed rain. But no, not these false teachers that Jude is talking about. And it's interesting, if you look over to 2 Peter 2 in verse 17, Peter talking about the same sort of person almost, and he refers to that kind of person as wells without water, which is a little bit different, but very related there, because the rain fills the well. And someone might see a well and they'd walk up to it and they'd be thirsty. They'd been traveling a while, and they'd lower the bucket down in it, and it would hit the bottom on the sand, and they'd hear it instead of a splash. Well, this well's no good. There's no water in it. Wells without water. I think that it is. That's a well that's really into hypocrisy right there. Of course, inanimate objects can't do that, but people can do that. And that's what Peter and Jude and Solomon were talking about. People that boast falsely about giving or about any other kind of obedience to God, doing good as far as that goes. And they were promising great things, but they really didn't come through with those things. A great lack of integrity. As I was reading about this and what different people had to say, nobody mentioned this, but I thought about the mirage. That part of the world, you know, when you're traveling and across the desert, and we've seen movies and depictions of this, people who are traveling and just got to have water, they're dying of thirst, and they see something in the distance because of the combination conditions of the land, of their mind, and their bodies failing, and they think they see, you know, here's an oasis, here's a source of water. It's a mirage. When they get closer, it's not really there. It's only in their minds. So the good that's done by the Solomon and Peter and Jude were talking about, it's just a mirage, because they're not people of honesty and integrity. A man who bears false witness against his neighbor is like a club and a sword and a sharp arrow. Now, how much more of an undesirable company could you have than someone who was capable of beating you and slicing you and piercing you with a club, a sword, and an arrow? You know, that pretty well describes the nature of the pain, the nature of how someone could hurt someone. How could they do it? Not with real weapons, but by bearing false witness. We see how much it can, we're literally ruin somebody's life, can't it? You know, we've seen stories, we've heard true stories, sometimes true stories. They make movies out of them where people are falsely accused and their lives are ruined because of what the false accusers say. Darrell says comparing it to a dangerous weapon, and it is a weapon capable of great destruction, and in fact, causing physical death, couldn't it? You bear false witnesses against someone. The penalty for whatever it is could be death, or they might reach a point of despair and giving up because of the consequences of someone else's false testimony. So these are lethal weapons. Lethal weapons. I like that. Anybody else? Okay, we will move on then. All right, got separate the verses here a little bit. Proverbs first two here, and then the last one has a little bit extra with it. He who hates disguises it with his lips and lays up deceit within himself. So all we've got is the between lying, especially to or about someone, and how you really feel inside. The hatred within, the condition of the heart. There is hatred and deceit within a very unhealthy situation for the one who's doing that. When he speaks kindly, this person that's this way, when he speaks kindly, do not believe him. You know, recognize the kind of person who disguises hatred by saying things that try to make you think he doesn't hate you or that he's not trying to deceive. When you figure out someone like that, be wise enough to say, well, you know, he sounds like he wants to be my friend. He sounds like he wants to help, but I don't believe him for a minute because I've already seen through other ways what's in his heart, what's inside of him. For there are 7 abominations in his heart. What's the significance of 7 abominations? 7 is complete. Remember that how many demons were inside Mary Magdalene? Go ahead and guess 7. 7. That's right. There were 7. In Matthew 13, Jesus talks about how many evil spirits. Go ahead and guess. 7. So it's like a complete number. It's like someone who's totally taken over by whatever it is that's in the number of 7. In other words, this person is as full of this as he can be. Well, in this case, his heart is as full of abomination as it can be. Remember what abomination is? That's which is disgusting. That's that which makes us sick at our stomach. We don't even like to look at it. And sometimes some things are called abominations before God. We talked about a proverb that had that. Though his hatred is covered by deceit. So we're talking about the pretender here still. We're talking about the true hypocrite that really pulling it off at pretending to be what he's not. In this case, someone who doesn't hate. His hatred is covered by deceit. His wickedness will be revealed before the assembly. In other words, it's going to come out. It's going to come out. You know, you can hide things like that for a while in some people. You know, they like the saying we have, fool some of the people some of the time. Not some of the people all the time, all the people some of the time, but not all the people all the time. Well, you know, a church person's true character, if they know very many people, they're around very many people, somebody's going to figure them out. Or they'll take somebody into their confidence, won't they? You know, they'll let their guard down. And they've been one way in front of everybody else, but they have maybe a co-conspirator or somebody who is sympathetic to their cause, and they'll let their guard down around that person. And sometimes that's the way it gets out. But this heart completely consumed by abomination, covering up, trying to cover up his hatred and his deceit. Through deceit, it's going to be known. Eventually, people will figure it out. It will be known in the assembly, and that could be like at the gates of the city, where the it comes out. This person is not at all what he is pretending to be. There's hatred in his heart. Okay. Yeah, here we go. This is first real image here. Okay, Kendall, go ahead. Okay, suggest that many times, just in everyday life, it's easy uh, to out, even though they do try to deceive with this style of interaction. You know that somebody doesn't. You know that somebody has that hatred inside, and they're putting up a front. And you want to talk about politicians there. We probably ought not to spend too much time talking about politicians. We're subject into trouble, won't we? But politicians, he suggests, sometimes, they smile and everything because their plan is to get even, not to get mad in front of everybody, but to get even. So deceit, hatred can be hidden by deceit, by pretensions, pretending to be something that a person is not. And describe what can happen to this person who's like that. And really vivid images. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. That's the guy on the right there. And that was the best best picture I could get of it. But he's made a hole there and he's fallen into it. That's the idea. Or he who rolls a stone will have it roll back on him. And I saw this a few weeks ago, and Satan said, "I'll find a good example of that." Rolling that stone right to the top, you give that last push, and you think, okay, it's going over down on my enemy now. And it teeters right at the top, and all of a sudden, it starts rolling back on you. And you're the one who's in trouble. Well, that's Solomon's point. You lay the trap. You plan the destruction of someone that you're trying to hurt, and it backfires. It rolls back on you. You fall into the pit. Of course, we could all probably think about cite, if we had the opportunity, a situation where we've seen that happen, where evil comes back to him, back to the person who intended it. Now, if you're thinking the same way I do, or did in this case, when we talk about the Old Testament, who's the first person that comes to mind who got that stone roll back on? Exactly, Haman. We're thinking, and we didn't talk about this today, I promise. We did not discuss this lesson, okay? We're just thinking alike here. Esther 7, verses 9 and 10. Now, Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Because the king, Ahasuerus, was really, really bad at Haman. And we don't have time to go into that. I think we talked about it not too long ago anyway. So the king said, hang him on it, which I'm sure is what Harbona probably expected was going to happen. Hey, there happens to be some gallows hanging around here if you really want to do something. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And the king's wrath subsided. They hanged Haman on the gallows prepared for Mordecai. You talk about a rock rolling back or falling into the pit that you dug yourself. Haman hated Mordecai. He refused to honor him in the way that he thought he should have been honored. So he decided to hate all the Jews, to try to destroy them. And he dug a pit. And he pushed a rock up on the hill to roll down on Mordecai and all the Jewish people. It rolled back on him. He fell in the pit. And the consequences were upon him. And I'm sure we can think of other examples, but that's one very clear one that came to mind as I thought about Old Testament examples of how that would happen. A lying tongue hates those who are crushed by it, and a flattering mouth works ruin. The action and the intent or the feelings go together. You know, the heart produces the behavior. A lying tongue, they just hate them. Those that get crushed by that lying tongue, they hate them. They really hate them. You can't say it any other way. You can't say, well, you know, I didn't mean for it to be that bad. You hate them. If you lie about somebody, consequences crush them, you hate them. A flattering mouth works ruin. It destroys somebody. Have you ever known someone, and don't raise your hand, and certainly don't call any names, but have you ever known someone that would tend to say after something that really hurt somebody else, oh, I was just kidding. I was just kidding. Didn't mean that. When the harm is already done, when the hurt is already made. Have any of us ever said something and then realized, you know, that hurt. I didn't mean for that to hurt, but that hurt somebody. Have we all done that? I've experienced that. And maybe quickly, maybe a few days later, we think, you know, I wasn't thinking when I said that. That really hurt somebody else. And that's why we need to be evaluating our actions rather than this person who says, I didn't mean that. Didn't mean for it to hurt. No, we didn't mean for it to hurt, but we need to be very cautious in what we say because it is ruin and it is crushing. And we need to, if we've done something like that, then we need to go straighten it out. And most of the time, I have found that people will say, oh, don't worry about it. I didn't even notice it. I don't know if it did or not. I'll take them at their word. You know, it didn't bother me. And I'm thinking, well, I thought it did. I thought it could have, you know, and I'd rather straighten it out than let it go. But this person's the opposite of that. They do it. It hurts. It hurts bad. I was just kidding. Just kidding. Didn't mean for anything. So don't get upset. Well, people do get upset when they're crushed, when they're ruined. And here is one of those star verses for me, one of those star proverbs. Not that all of them aren't good, all of them are inspired, but here is just one of those that we need probably to have a refrigerator magnet of. Open rebuke is better than love carefully concealed. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. We have a society around us. In my view, it's always been this way to some extent, and today it is even worse, at least in our country and our culture, that says we don't want to tell people the truth because it might hurt somebody's feelings. Hold the truth back. Don't be truthful because it might hurt somebody's feelings. Well, the wise man hit it right on the head right here. When someone is doing something that's going to hurt them eventually, we are not their friends if we don't tell them about it. When someone is involved in self-destructive behavior, whether it be physical or spiritual, You know, if we don't rebuke them in a kind, humble way, um, and we're not being faithful, we're not a faithful friend. That's what Solomon said here. You know, I don't want somebody who will always tell me that I'm right, always agree with me, because that person is really my enemy. It's my friend who will come to me and say, if you don't stop doing that, you're going to hurt yourself very much. That's what we want to hear. Now, it may not be very fun at the time, but that's what we want to hear. Now, the enemy, he can cover us with kisses and say everything's okay. But if we're on our way to destruction, we're still going to be destroyed, aren't we? So what's a friend and what's an enemy? Do you remember what the Apostle Paul said to the Galatians? By their enemy, because I tell you the truth. That's another way of saying the same principle. The answer that Paul knew was true, and he knew the Galatians would understand. No. When you tell somebody the truth, that will prevent them from making serious mistakes, you not become their enemy. In fact, you have become their friend. And someone who wants to gloss over it and pretend it doesn't exist and pretend it won't destroy them, that's their enemy. The kisses of the enemy. We don't want those. Now, Paul was trying to say to them, you need to quit going back to the old law, the old covenant. You know, you're under the law of Christ. You're trying to bring forth a law of works. You need to stop doing that. Because if they did that, if they try to live by that, what did that do to the law of Christ? Made it null and void. Yeah. If you're trying to save yourself by the works of the old law, you can't come and ask for grace. Two different things. You can't come to the covenant of Christ that way. So he was not their enemy. He was their friend, but he was telling them things that were painful, but when they worked through that pain, they're going to be saved. John? Yeah, John reminds us that a lot of people today don't believe there's absolute truth anyway. It's a frightening percentage on any of the polls that are taken of the people in our country that don't believe in absolute truth. And of course, if absolute truth did not exist, then things would be, my opinion, your opinion, one's as good as the other. But it's not that way. But that's exactly what happens, and that's certainly part of the foundation for people who don't want to hear anything condemned by Christianity, right? Christianity cannot win in the minds of the majority of this country because they do not want anything condemned. If they want religion at all, they want a happy religion. They don't want to do very much, and they want a lot of good results from it. But do not condemn any kind of behavior. That is rampant in our country, in our world. But if we let the world conform us into acting that way, we're not friends of people who are lost in sin. We're their enemies. We're smothering them with kisses, kisses that will lead them to eternal destruction. Because God has given us a message. It is absolute truth. It is the absolute truth, and he wants us to share it. And both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, what are you if you share the truth with somebody, even if it's painful at first? You're their friend. What are you if you pretend it doesn't exist? You're their enemy. And so many situations we can apply that. But we need to finish these last few Proverbs here before the next bell rings. One who increases his possessions by usury and extortion gathers it for him who will pity the poor. About this before when we talked about money, I believe, but it's got an application of integrity or honesty here as well. You know, you cheat people, you charge rates of interest, you extort money somehow, you know, you gather it eventually, you're going to lose it. It'll go to somebody who will take care of the poor, who will use it right. Justice will be met. To show partiality is not good, because for a piece of bread a man will transgress. This describes the sad moral condition of a lot of people. And if you're willing to show partiality, you know, somebody's going to suffer, somebody's going to pay for a verdict, somebody's going to, you know, get what they want, even for a little thing. A piece of bread. That's not very much, is it? To cause someone to sin by showing partiality. Okay, and this, a few chapters later from the other time, but I think it's almost parallel with the friend and the enemy, kisses of the enemy, you know, and the wounds of a friend. A man who flatters his neighbor spreads the net for his feet. If the neighbor's walking along and the pit's right there, and he's not paying attention, and you say, I ought to say something to him, but you know, he's not the kind of guy that takes correction very well. I think I'll just keep my mouth closed. I don't want to hurt his feelings. I don't want him to think that I think he didn't know how to walk, you know, down a road. So I won't say anything. He falls into that pit, or that net in this case, like they would set for to trap birds in those days. They put nets out and catch the birds' feet in them. You know, I'm not going to say anything because it might hurt his feelings. Well, that's a man who flatters his neighbor. Enemy. Destructive. Whoever is partner with a thief hates his own life. He swears to tell the truth but reveals nothing. Sounds like a courtroom scene, doesn't it? You know, you withhold information so that somebody else doesn't get the penalty they should. You're an accessory. That's what they call it in court today. You're an accessory. You know, swears to tell the truth, but I'll just keep my mouth shut. I won't tell him what I saw, because if I do, he's going to get in trouble. And again, in that case, justice is not done. Then finally, one more that I know we've talked about before when we talked about poverty, I think it was. But another one of the stars in my mind in Proverbs. Remove falsehood and lies far from me, give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food allotted to me. Why? I want just what I need, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or I be poor, lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. I don't want too much or too little if I can't handle it. Lord, give me what I can handle to serve you with, because I don't want to do either one of these extremes. Did I see a hand? Okay. Actually gotten done a few seconds before the bell rings, but it's going to ring anytime. Closing comments from anybody. Appreciate your input and attention on this. Remember, next Wednesday night, we'll be enjoying Vacation Bible School. Please take those cards out there on the table in the foyers and be inviting people. We'll have an adult class, different teacher each night. So if you don't like the first one, come back and hear one of the others. See, I say that because I'm the first one. So if you don't like the first one, you get the other shots at it. But please invite people. And then we'll have 2 more weeks of Proverbs, last Wednesday in June, the first Wednesday in July, because Dennis and his family vacation. So he said, I can have 1 more Wednesday before he starts next week in July. So we'll have 2 more weeks of Proverbs. Don't forget VBS.